Hello everyone, and welcome to the final instalment of the Novus World Architecture Day interview series. We've had an absolute blast bringing some huge names from Australian architecture to you and finding out why architecture matters to them. Last but certainly not least, today we bring you Callum Fraser from Elenberg Fraser Architects. Thanks so much for joining us on this ride, and thank you, Linda, from ArchitectureAU for hosting the series. For one last time, over to you, Linda.
Welcome back to the Novus World Architecture Day interview series. Today, we're talking to Callum Fraser from Elenberg Fraser. Callum founded his practice in 1998, which has grown from a small studio in Melbourne to now a global practice. He's also a councillor of the Heritage Council of Victoria and Victoria Chapter Councillor of the Australian Institute of Architects. Callum, welcome to the series.
Thank you, Linda. Sorry, past chapter councillor is
yes,
what I think
sorry, past chapter councillor. So for this interview series celebrating World Architecture Day, we're asking why architecture matters. Now, obviously for the profession, we know why it matters, but how do you communicate to the average person on the street why architecture should matter to them?
Look, fundamentally, we don't see architecture as a polarizing luxury product. So does architecture matter? What we would say is architecture lives. We experienced this when we're growing our practice, was that architecture, beholden to the kind of whims of rich people's houses or art galleries and discrete commissions, was always, kind of in the thrall or service of others in a way that we didn't really like it. So, at Elenberg Fraser, we have a deep love for architecture in all of its manifestations, whether that's infrastructure, construction, dressing, policy, ideas, books, the whole thing. And, we believe that, great architecture is the construction of great environments, and that they're places that kind of nurture us physically and emotionally. And as such, there's no right or wrong reading to architecture. People know it when they feel it.
So I guess you could, paraphrase the Beatles song and say architecture is all around us. I read that Elenberg architecture lives, yes. I read that Elenberg Fraser as a practice is based on the idea that architects are responsible for the built environment in its totality. Can you elaborate on what you mean by this? Sure.
We have resisted specialising, overly at Elenberg Fraser. We work in an area of construction, but we believe that architecture as an education is the last great general broad education, and that architects should be involved in all of the kind of manifestations of the city, whether that's from policy through finance, through design, through construction, through delivery and management. And for instance, a big section of our practice is dedicated to constructing the applets that allow people to engage with the built environment. So, I wouldn't put too narrow a beam on what architecture should be. What we would say is that it's a broad church. It encompasses a lot of different activities, and architects, by virtue of their kind of their breadth in education, are just ideally placed to have inputs at all levels of that conversation.
Yes, yes. So really the sort of Renaissance man idea of an architect.
More the Baroque than the Renaissance, but yes, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Your practice started working with developers on speculative projects at a time when not many other practices were doing that. What prompted you to go in this direction?
The practice of Elenberg Fraser grew out of an obvious need for architects to re-engage with the city as a whole. When I was finishing my university education, 40% of architects were driving taxis. The kind of culture of the discipline was just in disarray. And we felt that that was because architects had kind of abandoned the city to be able to work on projects which were perfectly kind of synchronous philosophically with how they felt about the universe. And as a result, were kind of, you know, in Melbourne, it kind of retreated into the outer suburbs where the kind of community-based architecture had a kind of, you know, a perfect kind of philosophical setting. But the output and the kind of corollary of that was the city was left, and development, speculative development, obviously continued to meet the needs of growing population. And so the city happened without its architects. And we grew this distinction between commercial and design architects, which seemed to us just to be an absurd distinction. So, you know, we have a strong feeling that architects should work in all aspects of construction. And so we chose to kind of head into the lion's den, if you like, and work directly through the mechanism of speculative development. We don't apologize for that. We think that the city is a much better place since design architects have been actively engaging with all of the outputs of construction of the city.
Speaking of commercial architecture, in the past few decades, we've seen an explosion of building stock, or in other words, property, traded as investment products. And by extension, architecture can also be seen as an investment product. So what is the value of architecture in that context?
Well, look, I don't think that we should get confused between the physical value of real estate and its concrete outputs with the value of architecture, which is cultural and collective. It is shared across the kind of community that we live in and the civilization that we're part of. You know, there's always that tension between, you know, a property town and a design town, the kind of whole, you know, Sydney, Melbourne thing, or New York, Chicago thing. As a kind of, you know, for me, it's a kind of dead end conversation. For me, architecture is intrinsic and owned by the civilization that kind of it is manifesting, and a world without architecture is a kind of barren world of dollars and cents.
Wow, isn't that frightening? Just dollars and cents. Can the value of architecture be quantified?
Look, like I just said, excuse me while I refresh my tea. I don't believe that. In my bio for this conversation, you would have seen Premier Tower, which is kind of this wonderful building that we're in the process of completing in Melbourne's West End. And, you know, that is a building which traded at 25% premium to the market, you know, at the time at which it sold. And so people were saying that, well, that was the value of architecture. It's kind of 25%, but we just don't see it like that. Because, you know, the rest of the time, the kind of city that's constructing is also led by architects. But what I would say is that architecture, when it's successful, when it kind of seizes upon the ambition of its time, it creates this thing which is bigger than itself, which is this kind of collective yearning for change and identity, and to feel like the built environment, which we're part of constructing, reflects our values and kind of envisions a world that we want to be part of. And that value is, for me, you know, the kind of the residual value of that artifact is much greater than the kind of listed property price. So I don't see that architecture is ever reducible to a per square metre or a capitalisation rate. You know, great architecture lives, great architecture is felt, great architecture has an enduring legacy for the city at large.
Yeah, that's true, right? Enduring legacy. The International Union of Architects has defined this year's theme for World Architecture Day as toward a better urban future. How do you think architecture can, as they say, make our communities strong, safe, equitable, and affordable?
Well, that is in every way the locus of architecture, and always has been. It's easy to get lost, you know, in the kind of conversation around the business of our cities. Sorry, you know, the kind of idea that the city is a kind of financial construct, which it is. But in every way, the role of architecture is to create inclusive, strong, equitable communities. You know, and that means not leaving anyone out. No, we're often, you know, feel like we're on our own in this conversation around the provision of housing in the city that we live in, because we believe that, you know, housing has to be affordable and it has to be equitable for the community that it serves. So we try to meet the kind of broader ambitions and requirements of the community in each building which we propose, and to not leave people out. So, you know, we've had to be quite inventive around that. The kind of, you know, for instance, with our apartment buildings at the moment, we have a plethora or a collection of community spaces that we build inside the buildings, which are shared among the building occupants. And, you know, people own and reside in the kind of smaller part of that, which is their private kind of, you know, residential areas. But then they get to enjoy the kind of creation of or collection of a great many other facilities within their buildings. And you know, those services and those facilities kind of are like massive palaces. You know, they have dining rooms, lounges, karaoke suites, entertainment areas, you know, whole fitness and wellness layers in the buildings that we're doing at the moment. And what we're finding is that kind of community cohesion, or that kind of belonging to the kind of community that shares those spaces, is the great benefit of multi-residential living. You get to feel like you're part of a kind of more inclusive community where you're known and have friends and kind of, you know, deeper than kind of, you know, passing engagements with people in the corridors, actually in buildings where you share interests and activities with a broader group of people. So, you know, architecture has the direct capability to create communities where people have a closer sense of belonging and a closer sense of freedom. You know, they feel that they can be themselves. So you know, we're 100% on program with the World Architecture Day theme. We believe that is the challenge, not just of this time, but of all times, which is, you know, to manifest our cities and to bring everybody along for the ride.
Yeah, so, and as you've just mentioned, there are many, many facets to creating well-designed multi-residential communities. How do you integrate, how do you create an integrated design that manages all these requirements?
That is a kind of tricky thing to do. So for me, I've always felt that architecture is kind of has, you know, in the past, probably kind of tried to occupy its own exclusive narrative through language, and that architecture is like some secret or forbidden knowledge. And while we talk that language and we know where that comes from, you know, we don't feel like that about our work. And I'll give you a reason why. Buildings today, it takes a sort of vast agreement amongst a kind of very broad group of people for buildings to become successfully realized. We track the number of people involved in each of our projects. And so, for instance, again, to take you back to Premier Tower, that list is alive and growing. We're up to 3,500 people that have had direct input into that building, whether that's from government and from the kind of the approval gateways and policy settings and the kind of capital markets that have supported and realized that building, through to design, through to construction, through to integration, the artists involved in the kind of output of those spaces, the management groups which are running the organization of the facilities and the ongoing operation of the buildings. It is a huge group of people. And so the challenge for architecture, you know, for me, is to find a kind of an idea, or a set of ideas which are strongly shared. Right, so for me, the kind of ideas of architecture must be direct, must be real. They must be real to us, because they must sustain us through 5 years of this kind of sort of weird Chinese whispers where things try to move sideways on us, you know. So, you know, the architect is a kind of at the center of the construction of a narrative and a set of kind of ideas which can be shared and understood by everybody involved in the procurement of that. And that means for me, Linda, that they're not just the architect's ideas. You know, that our job is to reify and to bring to life, into concrete reality, the ambitions and ideas of our time. So we would say that it is not possible to try to kind of maintain a very narrow view of the future, that for things to become real, it requires a very broad consensus. And for me, the corollary of that is that architecture is such a personal and kind of intimate activity. So, you know, the kind of both sides of architecture are very real for us, which is, you know, the ability to have those kind of private conversations, and the ability to kind of try to manifest, if you like, kind of collective ideas of the future, and to bring them together in a way that they can be delivered successfully. It is in every way a huge challenge.
Yes, yes, 3,000 people, that is a huge challenge. Your practice is a signatory to Architects Declare. So since signing the declaration, in what ways has this changed your practice?
Okay, so we have always had a kind of commitment at Elenberg Fraser to oh, I have to turn my messages off for you, excuse me, sorry. I was hoping that wasn't going to happen. Sorry, Linda, is it back to you?
That's right.
I was getting these texts on the phone saying, "What's happening, Cal?" Sorry, back to the question. Architects, you will have seen, have been leading the kind of the commitment in our industry to commit to a kind of a carbon neutral future, and that is in every way the great challenge of our times. So we're very proud of a community of architects for doing that. The job afoot is to make sure that amongst our own practices that we manage, you know, our material consumption, whether that's power or material itself, in as efficient a way as is possible. And I think recently we've become much better at becoming a paper-free office. You know, we offset the power that we use in the planting of trees and, you know, kind of various forms of carbon sequestration, and we promote through our own service agreements the supply of 100% renewable power. You know, the next part of that challenge is to bring that responsibility to all of the projects that we work on. And so for us, net zero carbon is the kind of platform with which all of our future projects grow, and the mechanism through which we leave the world not a worse place than we find it.
Yeah, yeah. And so obviously with climate change and the pandemic that is going on, we're seeing a confluence of a number of global forces. In your opinion, what is the biggest challenge facing architecture right now?
I think that the pandemic that we're in has kind of brought a lot of issues of equity to light in our community, and obviously realised an enormous amount of change which needs to be brought into the kind of safe planning and management of people and environments into the future. That is something that we are trying to lead and be part of, you know, in all of its ways. But as a society at large, we exist, you know, in the face of this climate disaster, which we are part of. And so every conversation that we have is measured, you know, with regards to how are we dealing with, you know, how does this affect the kind of, you know, the world of climate change that we are part of. And, you know, we're finding, you know, a series of kind of very innovative solutions to that. Architecture, for me, I think, you know, I kind of alluded to that before, is like a broad church that enables us to bring together kind of various specializations from our community. And, you know, the buildings of the future are very different to the buildings of the past. You know, I think gone are the kind of, you know, sort of flashy sort of materials imported that kind of, you know, consume a lot of energy. We build a lot locally these days, and we build beautifully, very low energy consuming environments. The corollary of working in multi-residential is that we're now committing our buildings to long-term 100% renewable power supply agreements. You know, in the face of our federal government proposing a gas-led recovery, which is the most stupid idea we could think of, you know, we have been committing all of our buildings to 100% renewable power supply through electricity. And, you know, while the government may have it completely wrong and provide zero leadership in that regard, as a community of professionals, we are standing in stark resistance to that and taking responsibility for our part and our role in the world.
An architect-led resistance.
I'm
Finally,
hoping that you can see the kind of iconography, adjacent to me, the sort of anarchy symbol. It reminds me every day, Linda, what my job is to kind of, resist the kind of status quo and the kind of the patterns of solidity from the past. Architects must renovate and be part of this revolution, and we must lead it.
yes, yes. How do you think architecture in the next decade will be defined?
I think for all the things that we've discussed, that architecture necessarily becomes a much more inclusive place. And as such, I think that, we will resist as a community this kind of polarizing stylistic objectives of architects and starchitects, that may have been the kind of meta narrative over the previous kind of, 20 years of the discipline. And, we have to bring a much broader consensus in the community to bear in the work that we do if we're going to affect change in such a broad phase. So, I see that the challenges facing our community and our world are so huge and so scary that architects realize naturally that we will not achieve a kind of a viable pathway through that on our own. And so inclusivity, I think, is going to drive a lot of the ways in which architects bring everybody on board to be part of this kind of new positive future that we see.
Yes, and as you said before, architecture is a broad church and architecture lives.
Hallelujah.
Callum, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Linda, for the conversation. That was fun.